The soft clink of a chain echoed across the concrete floor of the behavior assessment room at Valor K9 Transition Center. Behind the observation glass, 3 members of the review board sat in silence. A young volunteer stood in the corner, gripping a folder so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Less than 2 days remained before the euthanasia order would be carried out. In the middle of the room, a German shepherd named Rook stood motionless. Facing him was Ethan Calloway, a man who had spent more than a decade serving in elite Navy SEAL units and had persuaded the board to give the dog one final chance. Ethan took a slow breath, then raised his hand. One signal, then a second. Nothing. Rook remained turned toward the corner. The room grew so quiet that everyone could hear the heater humming somewhere down the hallway. Ethan frowned. Just hours earlier, those same signals had triggered a response. Now, nothing. One board member slowly closed the file in front of him. The oldest man in the room let out a weary sigh. If this is what you wanted us to see, I'm afraid our decision won't change. Then Rook suddenly backed deeper into the corner. His fur bristled, his body tightened. When Ethan carefully stepped closer, the dog reacted so violently that one of the board members instinctively stepped back. The entire moment lasted only seconds, but it might have been enough to seal the dog's fate. Ethan stood perfectly still, staring at Rook. He knew he was missing something. Something nobody had managed to understand during the past 3 months. And if he wanted to save this dog, he would have to find that answer before time ran out. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from today. We'd love to know how far this story travels. Thank you. Early spring arrived slowly in Red Pine, Montana. Patches of old snow still lingered beneath the pine trees outside town, while muddy water trickled through the ditches along Main Street. The mornings carried a damp chill that settled into jackets and truck seats, and the mountains beyond town remained capped in white, despite the warming days. Ethan Calloway preferred mornings. Most people in Red Pine knew him as the quiet veteran who helped other veterans fill out paperwork, drive to medical appointments, or repair things that had been neglected for too long. Few people knew much about the years he had spent overseas, and Ethan worked hard to keep it that way. That suited him. On a gray Tuesday morning, he sat across from an aging Marine named Walter Jennings inside the local Veterans Center. The old man was struggling to understand a stack of insurance forms while country music played softly from a radio near the coffee machine. Walter grumbled at the paperwork. Ethan translated. By the time they finished, the coffee had gone cold and sunlight had finally pushed through the clouds outside. Then Ethan's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Megan. A faint sigh escaped him before he answered. "Morning sunshine," his sister said immediately. Ethan closed his eyes. "Something's wrong. That's a terrible way to answer a phone. It usually saves time." Walter chuckled from across the table. Megan heard him. "See? Walter likes me. Why are you calling?" "Because I miss my brother." "No, you don't." "Okay, that's fair." For a moment, Ethan almost smiled. Almost. The sounds of barking drifted faintly through the phone. Valor K9 Transition Center. He recognized the background noise instantly. Megan worked there as a volunteer and somehow managed to love every difficult part of the job. The barking, the cleaning, the heartbreak, all of it. "Ethan," she said, her voice becoming more serious, "I need a favor." "There it is. Please don't hang up." "I'm not hanging up." Yet he rubbed his forehead. Walter quietly gathered his papers and slipped out of the room, leaving Ethan alone. Outside the window, a pickup truck rolled through the parking lot. The radio continued playing. Megan told him about a German shepherd named Rook, a retired military working dog, an animal that had spent years serving overseas. A dog that had survived injuries severe enough to require months of recovery at a military veterinary facility before being transferred to Valor. Ethan listened without speaking. Then Megan reached the real reason for her call. The dog was scheduled for euthanasia. 7 days. That was all the time left. "Ethan?" "No." The answer came immediately. Megan exhaled sharply. "You didn't even let me finish." "I know where this conversation is going. You haven't even met him." "I don't need to." Silence filled the line. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the window. Finally, Megan spoke again. "You used to help with cases like this." "That was a long time ago. He deserves a chance. So do a lot of dogs." The words sounded harsher than he intended. Megan fell quiet. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. Okay, the call ended, just like that. Ethan stared at the dark screen for several seconds before slipping the phone back into his pocket. The rest of the day passed normally, or at least it should have, but Megan's voice lingered in the back of his mind. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, another notification appeared on his phone, an email from Megan. Attached was a copy of an official review board decision. Ethan opened it. Then he read it again. The report described an incident that had happened the previous afternoon. A young volunteer named Tyler Brooks had entered Rook's kennel area alone. According to witness statements, Tyler had attempted to attach a leash while approaching from behind. When he unexpectedly reached around the dog's neck, Rook reacted with explosive force. Tyler hit the edge of a steel feeding trough. Several stitches. A trip to the emergency room. No bite, no attack. No aggression report. But the outcome had been enough. The board had concluded that the risk was no longer acceptable. At the bottom of the page sat a scheduled date. 7 days away, Ethan remained inside his truck long after darkness settled over Red Pine. Street lights reflected off the windshield. A train horn echoed somewhere beyond town. Across the road, a diner switched off its neon sign and closed for the night. The report rested on the passenger seat. He didn't start the engine. A cold wind pushed against the truck. Ethan thought about deleting the email. Instead, he read it again. The next morning arrived with low clouds and steady drizzle. Megan was carrying a box of donated blankets when she saw a familiar pickup truck roll through the front gate of Valor K9 Transition Center. The box nearly slipped from her hands. She set it down and hurried across the gravel lot. "You came?" Ethan climbed out of the truck. "I was driving by." Megan stared at him. "You drove 20 miles out of your way. I had business nearby." "There is no business nearby." He grabbed one side of the blanket box. Megan smiled despite herself. "You're impossible." "I hear that a lot." Together they walked toward the kennel buildings, the scent of wet cedar mixed with disinfectant in the cool morning air. Somewhere down the row of kennels, dogs barked excitedly at passing volunteers while others remained curled up on blankets. Megan filled him in as they walked. 20 families. 3 months. Every placement had ended the same way. People described Rook as distant, unoptionable, like he wasn't really there. "He doesn't play," Megan said. "He doesn't react when people try to bond with him. He barely acknowledges anyone. What do the vets say? Healthy. No medical issues? None." Ethan frowned. That bothered him. By the time they reached the final kennel building, the barking had faded. The hallway felt quieter, colder. Megan stopped beside the last enclosure. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan looked inside. A German shepherd sat in the far corner. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't move. His ears remained alert, but his attention seemed fixed on the concrete wall in front of him. A stainless steel bowl sat untouched nearby. So did several toys, a rope, a ball, chew bone. Rook ignored all of them. The kennel door rattled softly as another volunteer passed down the hallway. The dog didn't even turn his head. Ethan stood there for several seconds, watching. The German shepherd never looked back, and for the first time since arriving at the shelter, Ethan felt the weight of the 7 days ahead. Heavy, very heavy. Before we follow Ethan's journey through the final 7 days of Rook's fate, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. The rain lingered over Red Pine for most of the week. Water dripped from the kennel roofs. Mud collected along the gravel paths between buildings. Every morning, volunteers arrived carrying coffee cups and umbrellas, and every evening they left with damp boots and tired shoulders. Rook remained exactly where Ethan had first found him, in the corner, day after day. Ethan never brought a leash. He never carried training equipment or treats. He didn't test commands, challenge boundaries, or try to prove that years of military experience gave him some special advantage. Instead, he sat, sometimes on a folding chair outside the kennel, sometimes on the concrete floor, sometimes leaning against the chain-link fence while spring rain tapped softly against the metal roof overhead. And he talked. Not about dogs, about people. He told stories that no longer seemed important enough to tell anyone else. Long nights aboard ships, young operators who thought they were invincible, terrible coffee served in temporary outposts halfway across the world. Rook never turned around, but Ethan kept talking. Meanwhile, Megan buried him in paperwork. One afternoon, Megan dropped 3 thick folders onto a weathered picnic table outside the shelter office. 20 families, she said. Ethan looked at the stack. That's encouraging. She rolled her eyes. You're impossible. A damp breeze moved through the pine trees behind them as Ethan opened the first file. The adopter was a retired police officer living alone outside Boise. According to his notes, he spent nearly 2 weeks trying to build a routine with Rook. Morning walks, evening walks, obedience exercises, quiet time on the porch. Nothing caused problems, but nothing seemed to matter either. On the day he returned the dog, he wrote that Rook spent hours staring through the backyard fence as if he was waiting for someone who never came home. Ethan opened the second folder. A ranching couple outside Billings had hoped the open fields would help. They gave Rook room to roam, introduced him slowly to the property, and let him settle at his own pace. The dog never chased livestock, never damaged anything, and never showed aggression. After 17 days, the couple admitted they felt less like owners and more like temporary caretakers for a dog whose mind was somewhere else. The third file belonged to a veteran who had already adopted 2 retired working dogs over the years. He understood structure, patience, and routine better than most people. Rook followed every rule in the house and never created a single problem. Yet 3 weeks later, the man wrote a sentence that Ethan read twice. "I can train a dog," the note said. "I just don't know how to reach this one." Ethan closed the folder. The stories were different. The ending was always the same. The dog ate only when necessary. He ignored affection. He showed little interest in toys, games, or companionship. Some adopters wondered if he was grieving. Others thought he had suffered permanent psychological damage. Veterinarians disagreed. Every examination produced the same conclusion. Healthy, physically strong, no neurological problems, no hidden injuries, no explanation. That bothered Ethan more than anything. Answers usually left traces. This one didn't. The days passed quietly. Megan continued trying to save the dog through meetings and phone calls. Ethan continued showing up every morning. The shelter staff gradually stopped asking why he was there. Nobody had an answer. Neither did he. On the morning of the 5th day, the clouds finally broke. Sunlight filtered through the pines behind the shelter. Birds returned to the fence line. Somewhere near the office, someone was repairing a loose section of gutter that rattled every few minutes. Ethan sat outside Rook's kennel as usual. The German Shepherd remained in the corner, the same corner. Ethan leaned back against the fence. "You know," he said, "one of the dumbest guys I ever worked with became one of the best operators in the platoon." No reaction. Ethan smiled faintly. He got lost on a training exercise twice in the same week. Still nothing. The story drifted from one memory to another. Eventually, Ethan found himself talking about a deployment years earlier, when his team had been forced to move through darkness without speaking. The conversation shifted naturally toward hand signals. The silent language every operator learned. Without thinking, Ethan raised his hand. A simple signal. Rook stood up. Ethan stopped talking. For the first time all week, the dog had moved before being prompted by food, sound, or proximity. Slowly, Ethan made another signal. Rook sat, a third. The German Shepherd lowered himself to the ground. Neither moved for several seconds. Then Ethan tried again. Another signal, another response, another, and another. Each movement came cleanly and precisely, like something practiced thousands of times over many years. Footsteps echoed suddenly down the hallway. Megan appeared carrying a clipboard. She froze. The clipboard nearly slipped from her hands. "Ethan." He didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on Rook. The dog completed one final command and settled quietly onto the floor. Megan looked from Ethan to the dog and back again. Then she turned and ran. Actually ran. Her footsteps disappeared down the hallway. Several dogs began barking. A door slammed. Voices followed. Within an hour, the shelter director had been called. Then the veterinarian. Then the review board. For the first time since the euthanasia order had been approved, hope moved through the shelter faster than fear. The emergency evaluation was scheduled for that afternoon. A damp wind rolled across the property as staff members prepared the assessment room. Megan barely sat still through lunch. Volunteers whispered in hallways. Even people who barely knew Rook seemed invested in the outcome. 7 days suddenly felt less certain. A A few hours earlier, Ethan would have agreed. By 3 o'clock, Rook stood inside the evaluation room. 3 board members watched from across the room. Megan stood near the wall. Ethan stepped forward. The same signals. The same man. The same dog. Nothing. Rook remained facing the corner. Ethan tried again. No response. A third time. Still nothing. The room grew quieter with each passing second. Megan's hopeful expression slowly disappeared. One board member began writing notes. Another checked the file in front of him. Ethan crouched down. Carefully, patiently, he reached for a small piece of food. Rook immediately stiffened. The muscles along his shoulders tightened. His ears flattened. When Ethan moved slightly closer, the reaction came fast enough to startle everyone in the room. A board member instinctively stepped backward. The tension vanished only when Ethan stopped moving. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The silence said enough. The meeting ended less than 15 minutes later. Outside, the afternoon sun had already disappeared behind another layer of clouds. The parking lot looked smaller somehow. The shelter seemed quieter than it had that morning. Megan stood beside Ethan near the kennels. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, she asked the question that had been sitting between them since the evaluation ended. What happened in there? Ethan looked toward Rook's building. The answer should have been obvious. It wasn't. I don't know. The words lingered in the cold air. For the first time since arriving at Valor K9 Transition Center, Ethan wondered if he had been chasing the wrong answer from the very beginning. And somewhere beyond the kennel walls, time kept moving toward day 7. The shelter felt different after the failed evaluation. Volunteers still walked the kennel rows. Food bowls still rattled against concrete floors. Dogs still barked whenever someone opened the main gate. But the hope that had swept through Valor K9 Transition Center that morning was gone. Ethan noticed it everywhere. Megan noticed it too. For 2 days, neither of them talked much about the evaluation itself. There wasn't much to say. The board had not changed its decision. Rook still had only a handful of days left. The answer clearly wasn't sitting inside a training manual. It was somewhere else. On the 3rd morning, Megan dropped a thin personnel file onto the passenger seat of Ethan's truck. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. "This is everything the military released," she said. Ethan opened the folder. Most of the pages contained service records, medical reports, transfer documents, and deployment summaries. Near the back was a name. Staff Sergeant Liam Mercer. Ethan read it twice. The file showed 11 years of service together. 11 years. Longer than many marriages. Liam had been assigned to Rook shortly after the dog completed advanced training. From that point forward, nearly every major deployment listed in the file included both names. The partnership ended during Operation Iron Crossing. A brief summary occupied less than half a page. The team had been withdrawing from an ambush site in East Africa when one operator was wounded. According to the report, Liam turned back to help move the injured man to cover. Rook returned. Liam didn't. The official language remained cold and efficient. Paper often was. Ethan closed the folder. Outside, a freight train groaned somewhere beyond town. For a long moment, neither he nor Megan spoke. Then she pointed to an address highlighted near the bottom of the page. "I think we need to talk to his family." The drive took less than 30 minutes. Red pine slowly disappeared behind them as the road wound through pine-covered hills and open pasture land. Spring had finally started pushing winter away. Snow still lingered in the shadows, but patches of green had begun appearing along fence lines. The Mercer house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, small, quiet, well cared for. A wooden swing moved gently on the front porch. Nobody sat in it. Megan glanced toward Ethan as they walked to the door. "You going to let me do the talking?" "I usually do." "Good," she knocked. Several seconds passed, then the door opened. Claire Mercer stood on the other side. She looked younger than Ethan expected and more tired than anyone should have looked. There was no hostility in her expression. Just caution, the kind that develops after too many difficult conversations. Megan introduced herself first, then Ethan. He explained that they were visiting because of a retired military dog named Rook. Claire's expression barely changed. Her hand remained on the door. The conversation was already slipping away. Trying to help, Ethan added something he immediately regretted. "I served too, Navy SEALs. Different branch, but..." He stopped. Too late. Claire's eyes hardened almost instantly. The door moved an inch closer. My husband served too. Her voice remained calm. That somehow made it worse. Megan slowly turned toward Ethan. The look she gave him said enough. Why would you say that? Ethan didn't have an answer. He had spent years talking to veterans. Talking to widows was different. The door began closing. Then a small voice drifted from somewhere inside the house. Mom. A little girl appeared in the hallway clutching a worn stuffed rabbit against her chest. Sadie, 5 years old. She looked at Ethan and Megan before looking back at her mother. Then she said something that made the entire porch go quiet. Mom, Dad always said if someone carries bad news all the way to our door, we should at least let them come inside first. Nobody spoke. The wind moved gently through the trees. A screen door creaked somewhere nearby. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. Then she stepped aside. The living room carried signs of a family still trying to adjust to an empty chair. Children's drawings covered one wall. A framed military photograph rested on a bookshelf. An unfinished model ship sat beneath the window, collecting dust. Sadie climbed onto the sofa while Ethan explained why they had come. He told Claire about the shelter, the failed adoptions, the upcoming euthanasia date, the failed evaluation. He left nothing out. The room remained quiet. Then he said Rook's name. Sadie's head lifted immediately. Rook? Ethan nodded. A faint smile appeared on her face for the first time. Dad used to bring him home. Claire looked down at her hands. Sadie kept talking. He slept outside my room. Another smile. He liked my orange tennis ball better than his own. Megan laughed softly. Sadie did too. For a few seconds the room felt lighter. Then the memory passed. Silence settled back in. Claire turned toward the window. There are memories that arrive loudly. Others barely whisper. Those are often the hardest ones. Several minutes passed before Claire stood. Nobody stopped her. She disappeared down the hallway and returned carrying a wooden box. The edges were worn smooth from years of use. She placed it carefully on the coffee table. Inside rested pieces of a life interrupted. Military dog tags, family photographs, a folded campground reservation confirmation, a ticket stub from a baseball game, the unfinished model ship's instruction booklet, and beneath everything else, a journal. Claire touched the cover briefly before pulling her hand away. Liam wrote in it whenever he was away. Nobody moved. Eventually, Ethan opened it. The first page wasn't about combat. It wasn't about deployments. It wasn't even about Rook. Instead, it described a Saturday morning pancake disaster involving Sadie and a kitchen covered in syrup. Several pages later, Liam wrote about teaching his daughter how to skip stones across a lake. Then there were notes about Claire. Small observations. Things he never wanted to forget. The journal felt less like a military record and more like someone trying to hold on to ordinary life. Rook appeared eventually. Not as equipment, not as a working dog, not as an asset, as family, a companion, a constant presence woven into stories about backyard games, camping plans, and evenings at home. The afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the living room carpet as Ethan continued turning pages. For days he had been studying behavior reports, veterinary records, and evaluation notes. This felt different. For the first time since arriving at the shelter, he wasn't reading about what Rook had become. He was learning who Rook had been, and somewhere inside those pages, Ethan began to suspect the answer had been waiting there all along. The journal went home with Ethan that evening. The last light of the day stretched across the valley as he drove back toward Red Pine. Patches of old snow still clung to the shaded hillsides, and scattered ranch houses glowed softly against the approaching dusk. The road felt longer than usual. By the time he reached his cabin, the coffee in his travel mug had gone cold. He spent most of the night reading. Some entries filled only half a page. Others stretched across several days. Liam wrote the way many soldiers talked when nobody was listening, direct, practical, and unexpectedly honest. One entry described a camping trip that had been canceled because Sadie caught the flu. Another complained about spending 3 hours assembling a toy kitchen only to discover he had installed the doors backward. A few pages later, Liam wrote about Claire. Not dramatic declarations, small things, the way she always stole fries from his plate, the way she fell asleep during movies and insisted she had watched the entire thing, the way she pretended not to worry whenever he deployed. Ethan found himself smiling. Then the pages shifted. Rook appeared more often. not as a military working dog, as family. One entry described how the German Shepherd refused to ride anywhere except the passenger seat of Liam's pickup truck. Another told the story of Rook stealing Sadie's orange tennis ball and carrying it around for 3 days before finally giving it back. One passage made Ethan stop reading. Every time I come home, I use the same signal before I take off my gear. 2 fingers to my chest, then down toward the ground. Doesn't matter where we are, doesn't matter how long I've been gone. It's our way of saying we're home and everything's okay. Ethan read the line once, then again more slowly. The signal sounded familiar, very familiar. The next morning, he drove back to the Mercer house. Claire answered the door with the same caution as before. But this time she opened it without hesitation. That was new. Inside, Sadie sat at the kitchen table, drawing pictures with colored pencils. The orange tennis ball appeared in one corner of nearly every drawing. Ethan noticed. So did Claire. Neither mentioned it. Over the next several days, conversations became easier. Not warm, not yet, but easier. One afternoon, while reviewing shelter options, Megan proposed something that would have sounded impossible a week earlier. What if we bring him here? Claire looked up from the paperwork. Megan continued carefully. Temporary placement. Extended evaluation. He'd still be under the shelter's supervision. We'd handle the paperwork. Ethan can help monitor the transition. Silence settled over the room. Outside, a breeze moved through the pine trees. Somewhere down the road, a screen door slammed shut, and then everything became quiet again. Claire kept looking toward the backyard. Nobody rushed her. Finally, she nodded. Let's try. 3 days later, Rook arrived. The shelter vehicle pulled into the driveway shortly before sunset. The sky glowed orange behind the hills, and long shadows stretched across the grass. Rook stepped out slowly. His ears moved, his nose lifted. For several seconds, he simply stood there, watching the backyard fence, the porch, the swing, the old maple tree near the corner of the property. Sadie remained beside her mother. Neither approached. Neither rushed him. That had been Ethan's suggestion. Let him choose. The first night passed quietly. Rook barely touched his food. He spent most of the evening lying near the back door. The second night was different. The food bowl was empty by morning. Nobody mentioned it. They simply remembered which side of the bowl had been full the night before. A few days later, Sadie carried her orange tennis ball into the backyard. She wasn't trying to train the dog. She wasn't trying to fix him. She was being 5 years old. The ball bounced once across the grass, then rolled to a stop. Rook watched it. Nothing happened. Sadie shrugged and picked it up. The next throw landed closer. This time, Rook stood. Only for a moment. But Ethan saw it. By the end of the week, the German Shepherd had begun following Sadie into the yard. Not every time. Most of the time. That was enough. At night, another change appeared. Claire noticed it first. One morning, she opened Sadie's bedroom door and found Rook asleep in the hallway nearby. Not inside the room, not touching the door, just close enough. The next night, he chose the same spot. Then the night after that. Nobody commented on it. Some things felt too fragile to discuss aloud. Meanwhile, Ethan kept returning to the journal. One unfinished promise after another appeared between the pages. A camping trip Liam had planned for summer. A model ship he wanted to finish with Sadie. Several places around Montana he had promised to visit as a family. One Saturday morning, Ethan loaded supplies into his pickup truck. The campground reservation tucked inside Liam's keepsake box sat on the passenger seat. Claire watched from the porch. Sadie climbed into the truck. Rook settled into the back. The reservation had been sitting inside Liam's keepsake box for nearly a year. Now someone was finally using it. The trip wasn't perfect. The temperature dropped quickly after sunset. The campfire refused to cooperate, and Sadie managed to drop a marshmallow directly into the dirt before anyone could stop her. Everyone laughed. Even Claire. The sound surprised her more than anyone else. A few weeks earlier, Claire would have packed Liam's keepsakes away before anyone touched them. Now she handed Ethan the instruction booklet for the unfinished ship model and pulled out a chair at the dining room table. That evening, the three of them worked through the tiny wooden pieces while Sadie offered completely unhelpful advice. The model slowly began taking shape. So did something else. Respect. Not friendship, not forgiveness. Those things take longer, but respect had arrived. The answers were finally starting to make sense. Unfortunately, the shelter board was still waiting for proof. The extension period granted by the shelter board was coming to an end. For nearly 6 weeks, Rook had lived with Claire and Sadie under temporary placement while the shelter monitored his progress. Reports had been filed, follow-up visits had been completed, notes filled several folders inside Megan's office. Now everything came down to one final evaluation. The morning arrived cool and clear. Thin clouds drifted above the mountains surrounding Red Pine, and sunlight reflected off patches of snow that still lingered on the highest ridges. Claire drove. Sadie sat in the backseat beside Rook with an orange tennis ball resting on her lap. Ethan followed behind in his pickup. Nobody talked much during the drive. Some days felt too important for unnecessary words. When they arrived at Valor K9 Transition Center, several staff members were already waiting. Most of them knew Rook's story by now. Some had watched him sit motionless in his kennel for months. Others had witnessed the failed evaluation that nearly sealed his fate. They were curious, but they were also careful not to expect too much. Inside the assessment room, the process began exactly the way it would for any other dog. The board had no interest in emotional stories. Their responsibility was safety. Rook entered the room calmly and remained beside Claire while the evaluators reviewed a series of routine exercises. They observed his response to unfamiliar people, his reaction to environmental distractions, and his ability to remain under control during stressful situations. Nothing looked dramatic. That was a good sign. The first several tests passed without incident. Rook remained alert throughout the process. His ears tracked every movement, and his eyes followed the person entering the room, but he stayed composed. A few months earlier, that alone would have been remarkable. The evaluation continued. One board member approached and briefly handled the leash. Another walked around him while taking notes. The shelter veterinarian observed quietly from one side of the room. Everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. Then an unexpected noise shattered the rhythm. A metal clipboard slipped from a volunteer's hands and struck the concrete floor with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the room. Several people flinched. So did Rook. His body stiffened immediately. His head snapped toward the noise, and for a brief moment the tension everyone remembered returned to the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The evaluator closest to him froze in place. Rook turned away from the fallen clipboard. His eyes searched the room. Then found Ethan. The former SEAL stood near the back wall, exactly where he had been throughout the assessment. He didn't step forward. He didn't call the dog's name. He simply raised 2 fingers to his chest before lowering his hand slowly toward the floor. The same signal Liam had described in his journal. Home, safe, everything's okay. For several seconds, Rook watched him. The room remained completely silent. Then the German Shepherd's posture softened. The tension left his shoulders, and he lowered himself calmly onto the floor. The moment passed. Simple, quiet, almost easy to miss. Yet everyone in the room understood what they had just witnessed. The evaluation continued for another 20 minutes. Rook wasn't perfect. No dog was. He still showed caution around sudden changes. He still preferred predictable routines and familiar people. Years of military service had shaped him in ways that would never completely disappear. But there was a difference between a dog that required understanding and a dog that posed an unacceptable risk. The board recognized that difference. When the assessment ended, everyone was asked to wait outside while the board met privately. The spring sun had climbed higher by then. Volunteers moved between buildings carrying supplies, and the distant sound of barking drifted across the property. Sadie sat cross-legged in the grass beside Rook. Claire stood quietly nearby. Ethan leaned against a fence and watched the clouds move over the mountains. The meeting lasted almost half an hour, long enough for everyone to replay the morning in their minds. When the board members finally emerged, nobody needed to be told that a decision had been reached. The shelter director stepped forward. The euthanasia order is withdrawn. Claire lowered her head and covered her eyes. Sadie immediately wrapped both arms around Rook's neck. The dog accepted the hug without complaint. A few staff members smiled. Others simply looked relieved. The director continued. Claire's adoption application had been approved, subject to periodic reviews during the first year. The shelter would continue monitoring Rook's adjustment, and additional evaluations could be requested if concerns emerged. Claire agreed without hesitation. Then the director turned toward Ethan. The shelter wanted him listed as a support contact and behavioral advisor should future questions arise. Ethan signed the paperwork, not because anyone forced him to, because it felt right. Summer arrived slowly in Red Pine. The hills turned green. Fishing boats returned to the lake. Children filled the parks that had stood empty during winter. Life kept moving. The Mercer family did too. Rook settled naturally into routines that nobody had planned and no training manual could have predicted. He accompanied Claire on evening walks, waited patiently while Sadie rode her bicycle through the neighborhood, and still chose the hallway outside her bedroom door almost every night. Some habits remained important. One Saturday several months later, Ethan stopped by the house carrying a tackle box and 2 fishing rods. Sadie ran outside before he even reached the porch. Rook followed close behind. Claire stood in the doorway watching them with a small smile. The old tension that once filled the house was gone. Not forgotten, just no longer in control. The lake wasn't far away. Neither were the memories of Liam. Nobody pretended otherwise. The empty places he left behind would always remain part of the family's story. But those places no longer felt quite so heavy. As the afternoon sun reflected across the water, Sadie sat at the end of a dock while Rook rested beside her, watching the shoreline with the same steady attention he once brought to military deployments. The German Shepherd had never replaced Liam. That had never been his job. What he offered was something different. A connection to the man they loved. A reminder of promises worth keeping. A reason to keep moving forward. Ethan looked toward the shore where Claire was unpacking sandwiches from a cooler. Then he glanced at Rook. The dog lifted his head briefly before settling back down beside Sadie. For a moment, everything looked exactly where it belonged. And that was enough. Sometimes the biggest changes don't arrive with a dramatic moment. Sometimes they show up quietly, in the small things people almost miss. An empty food bowl that used to be untouched. A dog choosing to sleep outside a child's bedroom door. A family sitting around a table, finishing a project that someone they loved never got the chance to complete. What stayed with me most about this story wasn't the final evaluation or the paperwork that saved Rook. It was the reminder that healing often begins when someone is willing to stay, listen, and understand. Not every wound can be seen. Not every loss can be explained. Yet people keep finding ways to carry each other forward. This story is fictional, but the grief, loyalty, sacrifice, and hope behind it are deeply real. Many of us know what it feels like to miss someone who should still be here. Many of us have learned that moving forward does not mean leaving them behind. Sometimes God's answer isn't to erase the pain. Sometimes His grace appears in the people, memories, and unexpected companions He places beside us while we walk through it. My prayer tonight is simple. May God bring comfort to those carrying quiet grief, strength to those facing difficult days, and peace to those who are still learning how to move forward after loss. And may we never overlook the small acts of kindness that help someone keep going. If this story reminded you of a person, a pet, or a memory that still means something to you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Feel free to share your thoughts or prayer requests. And if you enjoy grounded stories about loyalty, healing, and human connection, please like and subscribe. As for me, I keep thinking about that orange tennis ball resting in the grass and a German Shepherd choosing to follow it again after so much silence. Some days, the quietest signs of hope are the ones that stay with us the longest.